Hey, time for another edition of Paraphrase Power. This time we again have another dual passage. This one, a dual short passage from an SAT. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to have you read passage one. Read passage one and try to paraphrase it. Try to put the argument, put the main idea in your own words. So go ahead, take a few minutes, read passage one, and paraphrase it. Okay, so what is the main idea? What is the argument of this small little passage one? The main idea, basically, is that even though the world is, in some sense, a large place, it is getting smaller. And the main reason it's getting smaller is because of technology. Technology allows people to communicate, interact in ways that shrinks physical space, right? So today we can physically circumnavigate the world in one day and electronically orbit the planet in just 8 seconds. And then it goes on to give other examples or other little aspects of this. So first passage is the world is getting smaller due to technology, due to electronic communications and transportation. All right, now let's go ahead. Let's read passage two, do the same thing, summarize the main argument. Now, this passage is a bit more complicated, so we're actually going to go through this one sentence by sentence to really make sure that we understand what is going on here. So, first sentence, our world, seemingly global, is in reality a planet of thousands of the most varied and never intersecting provinces. Notice it says the world is seemingly global, so it seems like we have this global, read, interconnected kind of planet, interconnected kind of peoples. But in reality, it's a planet of the thousands of the most varied and never intersecting provinces. In other words, they don't overlap. The different parts of the planet are, in some sense, separate from each other. A trip around the world is a journey from backwater to backwater. A backwater is kind of a place far away from civilization, or something that's, again, kind of isolated. Each of which considers itself, in its isolation, a shining star. Again, the world is a patchwork of these isolated regions. For most people, the real world ends on the threshold of their house, at the edge of their village, or at the very most on the border of their valley. In other words, people have a very local, limited view of their world. Their world ends at their house. It ends at the edge of the village, ends at the edge of their valley. Again, we're getting this image of this patchwork, this set of never intersecting isolated regions, and that people are actually more isolated than we might think they are. That which is beyond is unreal, unimportant, and even useless, whereas that which we have at our fingertips in our field of vision expands until it seems an entire universe overshadowing all else. So in other words, that which is beyond the valley, that which is beyond the village or the house, is unreal, unimportant, and useless, but that which is at hand, right at the fingertips, expands until it seems an entire universe overshadowing all else. In other words, that which is at the fingertips that we can see takes on the utmost importance. So that's the argument for passage two. To summarize it, even though the world may seem global, in fact, we are still this patchwork of isolated provinces, of isolated areas, and people generally have a very local focused view, not a global view. So now what I want you to do is take a minute, think about what is the relationship between these passages. Do they make the same argument? Do they make a different argument? Do they make arguments that don't really relate? And exactly how do those arguments relate to one another? So go ahead and think about that. The relationship between these passages is pretty clearly opposite, right? Passage one is all about how the world is smaller, that it's, even though it's global, even though it's large, we are this interconnected group of people due to technology, due to communications technology, due to transportation. Whereas passage two makes the opposite point, that even though we have perhaps these technologies, we are still this patchwork of isolated regions. We still focus on what we can see and what's at our fingertips rather than what we can't see. So these two passages are pretty clearly opposed to one another in how they see the world and how they see our interconnectedness or lack thereof. So now that we have an understanding of the two passages, let's do a question. And indeed, this question is, which of the following best describes the relationship between the two passages? So go ahead, try this question on your own, and then we'll talk about it. So as we just said, we're looking for an answer that shows an opposite relationship. So let's go through each of the choices. They criticize similar developments. Well, passage 1 doesn't really criticize anything. In fact, it's pretty positive towards the technological changes that have allowed for this interconnectedness. Maybe we might see some sort of critique in 2, maybe, but the problem is both of the passages don't criticize something similar. There's no criticism in 1 at all, so we can get rid of A. They illustrate antithetical attitudes. Let's come back to this one. They have compatible agendas. Well, no, compatible would imply that they're similar, right? That they're making the same kinds of arguments, that they agree. And as we've said, that's not true. They draw the same conclusion using different research methods. Whether or not they use different research methods, I mean, frankly, we have no idea what their research methods are. All they're stating in these passages are their claims. We have no sense in which they tell us how they came to those claims. But more importantly, again, they're not drawing the same conclusion. They are opposite. They both examine changes in the perception of an issue over time. So be very careful with this one. They both examine changes in the perception of an issue over time. So remember, when you're looking at a choice, every single part of that choice has to work. So are these passages talking about the perception of an issue? If they are, perhaps the issue is something like how interconnected the world is, maybe? And if you put it like that, I suppose that might work. But then the problem we have is over time. There's no sense in which we have a progression over time in either of these passages, right? Each of these passages just gives us a sense of how things are now. Though now that I reread it a little bit, they do mention the 19th century, and then they do mention today. So I guess there's a little history in one, but the changes over time would have to be more extensive than this, right? They would have to be more than just, oh, this is something that happened in the late 19th century and this is today. I mean, I suppose it is okay. Even if we granted that that was okay for passage 1, we don't see any kind of progression over time in passage 2 at all. So we can get rid of E. So we're left with B. I left B because sometimes the problem with this one is what the word antithetical means. So take a minute and if you don't know what this definition is, break this down. Do you see any prefixes or roots or suffixes in this word that might help you? And indeed, you might see this, anti. Think about anti. Anti means against, opposite, contrasting. And that's exactly what we're looking for, right? The two passages are supposed to be opposite. They're supposed to disagree. So antithetical means opposing. Basically, if you have antithetical attitudes, they're opposing or mutually contradictory attitudes, right? They don't mix, they disagree. So B fits perfectly with what we read, so we're going to go with choice B. To learn more about Reason Prep's SAT, SAT subject test, and ACT video courses, go to reasonprep.com/enroll, and you can find the link in the description below the video.